Today we're going to be doing another prophetic word. It's a uplifting and encouraging prophetic word. So I'm excited to share it with you all today. I hope you're all doing well. This word is about a twofold movement into a new home. And when I say it's twofold, it's because part of this movement into a new home is a physical movement, and part of this movement is a movement into, you could say, higher states of consciousness, even mystical awareness, ancient wisdom that may be stuff that you're connecting to through your Akashic record, through past lives. And it may be something that you're connecting to from times past where there was previous renaissances of intelligence and light. Just like I'm thinking about how Venice, a picture of Venice just came up on my Google screen, and how so much culture and history is there, and the museums in Italy all over hold so much of important world cultural history, but especially Venice has an incredible wealth of actual all sorts of art and architecture and ancient books that are just replete with things to be remembered. It's so funny now talking about Italy, because on my Google screen, these are just images that pop up on my TV from my Chromecast, and there's the Colosseum in Rome just came up again. Italy seems to be really wanting to speak, which is really interesting. So yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of things that are coming up that, yes, they're from the past, but it's part of moving you into this new home and this new higher consciousness that you're building with the Lord, and with your, you could say, with your higher self, with your soulmate, with the part of you that is pulling you upwards into less separation, into the unveiling, less illusion, blocking the truth of the absoluteness of the Lord ruling and dictating and determining, everything that's happening in your life. And now that on my screen there's mountains and looking down on these snowy mountain peaks from very on high, which is speaking to attaining enlightenment and attaining higher consciousness. Like I said, this new home is a place where you're going to dwell in higher consciousness on a regular basis, instead of like collective consciousness or matrix consciousness on a regular basis. So you're leaving completely behind, everything that you thought at one point was the basis for what was real, and realizing that that was just an illusion, and that absolutely everything can only truly be created by God. And that's going to lead to real prosperity. There's like rolling hills showing up on my screen now as we're doing like Chromecast oracles. But anyway, there's like rolling hills, right, with a path, and rolling hills are speaking about, with greenery on them, with grass on them, speaks to moving forward, going ahead in lush prosperity. Grass speaks about wealth and prosperity. Green pastures speak to a lot of fertility and wealth. So there's and the rolling hills kind of speaks to the fact that, yes, you're getting this like really higher consciousness, right, like I said, but there's an earthy new home as well that is in these rolling pastures that you're also getting, that's going to be physically prosperous and nourishing for you as well. So, and so that's really exciting. And there's some, like I said, there's some ancient wisdom that's a part of that whole movement into the new that you're going to be getting little treasures from in the near future, which may involve some travel as well. There's definitely some hints from that in some of the Bible passage today for today's word. So the first passage I'm going to talk about is from Genesis, and it starts at Genesis 28 verse 13, where Jacob is having a dream, and in the dream, he's getting a message from the Lord. And it says, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And then now we're on verse 15. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then it says in 16, it says, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. And in verse 17, it says, he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So, and then it talks about specifically about in the notes in the NIV Bible about how there's a relationship between the Mesopotamian ziggurat stairways and Jacob's awakening that he had in the tree of life in the Jacob's ladder to heaven. We have our nasty chess pieces on the screen right now. Okay, we'll get to it. But every time those show up, there's always interference in what the Lord is trying to do by enemies of the Lord. So, as that is said, I'm going to say a verse 20 from Genesis, and it says, if God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. So this is what happens after the dream. He sets up a stone. He wakes up the next morning. He had a stone pillow under his head. Then he takes the stone and he sets it up as a pillar. He pours oil on top of it, and he calls that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. And that's when Jacob makes that vow about God being with him. I guess on that journey where he's leaving his safe home and going to be amongst, as he's heading to this new home, as he's walking through this heavenly gate, how he's going to be basically protected by God as he's making, through this connection through Jacob's ladder to heaven, while he's also making this journey on the pasture lands to cultivate the pastures to develop physical prosperity. And he does end up then going and coming upon a well, and that's how he ends up meeting his wife and the person who he wants to marry, although he ends up having to marry Leah before he marries Rachel, the girl that he meets that he wants to marry. But without getting into all of that, he ultimately does end up developing a lot of prosperity, and eventually he ends up taking all of that back to his homeland. But he does experience a lot of trials along the way. and there's issues about him getting his fair, I guess, returns on the work he's putting in. And so I guess I think what God's trying to say here is that you're headed on a journey, and it's a journey that is leading you to a lot of prosperity in a lot of ways. The gates of heaven have been opened for you for this spiritual and material prosperity, but it's not necessarily going to be without challenges, because there's still people that are going to be, you're going to come across along this way that have their own interests, right? Hence the chessboard. And there's still a lot of players that recognize that the kind of moves God's making here and now with you, if you're resonating with this message, have enough power to them that they actually put a lot of threat to the powers that be in the world right now. And it's literally like a rising of the house of David in a lot of ways, so that though there is not going to be the same kind of dependence on former mega authorities like major political powers and governments right now in the world, like major influential and wealthy pharmaceutical companies and the whole pharmaceutical industry, and things like that, are really threatened. And these are, trillion-dollar industries, and, even if it's government, there's so much lobbying and money involved with government that even though you might seem small, these things that God is creating and producing through you, through unlocking these doors of Jacob's ladder to the whole tree of life, to create as a true king, like as a righteous king, or amongst righteous kings in a community with righteousness at its head. It's a big move for God, and it's bound to be that there's going to be some opposition along the way as this unfolds. Having said that, it doesn't mean that it's going to be stopped. And as we know, looking at Jacob's story, yes, he goes through challenges, but ultimately he attains all the wealth and brings it back to his homeland. And then there's so much abundance that he ends up basically forming the seed for all the 12 tribes of Israel, right? He ends up with 12 sons, and he ends up having to get his own land when he comes back, because there's not room in where he originally came from with Esau. And there's just it was so significant for the whole original formation of Israel. And they even renamed him Israel. It was of that significance. So, and the other passage that we're really going to look at here is related to King David. And I think that that's appropriate for this particular conversation, because King David really represented the unification of Israel, right, of all the 12 tribes of Israel under one, righteous authority, in which ultimately served to bring home the Ark of the Covenant. And that was a very significant moment as well for Israel. And what's happening now is another, and I don't want to just like say everything else doesn't matter, but these are just examples of a similar move that God's making right now for the rebuilding of Israel and for the kingdom of God, right? Because Israel fundamentally is about being re-invited to a direct kind of connection with the Lord and to the one true God, and the awesome powers of God that can show themselves when you are obedient to God and connected to the tree of life, right? Because these kinds of miraculous things that they talk about in the Bible that happen, and with Moses as well, and with many figures in the Bible, these miraculous things that happen, it's always because of their obedience and humility to the Lord, and because of that being opened up to channel, and maybe some people don't like that word channel, but to basically be the vessel that permits God's awesome glory to present and make manifest in the world. And because without that conduit, without that conscious human witnessing, it can't happen. It doesn't, it never just happens without that, an intentionality or around a devotion around it. And, you're ready to be that devotional witness in a lot of ways. And I hope that makes sense. So it's pretty exciting. And, so the other word that I was asked to look at about this is from 2 Samuel 6, where the ark is brought to Jerusalem. And it specifically says here for verse 17, they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. Verse 18, after they had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. And then it talks about how he gives everybody cakes. In verse 19, it says, then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. All the people went to their homes. And then in verse 20, it says, when David returns home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. And David's response to that is, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. And in verse 22, it says, I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. So the one part I skipped over there was where basically, as they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant home, David was dancing in a linen ephod before the Lord with all his might as they're bringing up the ark to celebrate. And they're singing and they're playing music. And this is quite interesting because, I don't know exactly what it looked like, but a linen ephod, it was something that they would wear it was not like full clothing. It was, so they were, it's hard to know in today's terms exactly what half naked meant to them. Maybe half naked to them wouldn't seem naked to us today, but because we're more used to like less clothing and not wearing like 5 layers of robes like they often did, especially when it was cold. They would be wearing just layers and layers of robes. And they didn't have like the kind of jackets and stuff that we have today. It was just different. So anyway, he's dancing there in a linen because God told him to like dance in this very little clothing, and being completely, almost like just like a completely uninhibited child worshiping with absolutely no, we'll just say pride or ego or adultness or needing to look impressive. Like literally he was just completely, like I was saying, completely obedient to the Lord, and allowing, with talking about this like violent dancing and stuff, and like these movements, and like this, just allowing this like music to come through in whatever way the music wanted to come through, and praising, just with no fear about what people really gonna think about me, just knowing that through having developed and allowed for that pure relationship to the Lord to be matured in him, because it had already matured in King David, for him to come to this place of receiving the ark, and the maturity of his obedience to the Lord actually brought him into this almost like childlike state of complete surrender, and just like, I will do anything for you, God, even if I look like an absolute fool, like even if I, because he realized that, as all great leaders should and ultimately will in the future, that the only way you can truly lead righteously is to do it without any sort of ego whatsoever. That true blessing, godly blessing, like receiving the Ark of the Covenant, receiving that kind of blessing and authority and power, requires absolute humility. And it's almost like receiving that home in God, and the full breadth of the teachings of God, available through the covenant, requires a full unveiling of self, right? Coming to the nakedness of who you are, without any ideologies, without any layers of illusion about you being something that you're not, right? So the less you there is, they talk about sometimes about this in some modern teachings like Joe Dispenza, but they're distorted teachings. But they come from a place of truth when they're talking about how when you eliminate you and you become the nothing, then how you can create the everything. And there is some truth in that, but it's a little distorted, because it's lost its focus on the fact that you're humbling yourself before God, and that there is an authority over you that is actually the ultimate creator of your life, and that power of creation that's coming from you being nothing is the Lord. So it's just, you just can't take, I guess, God out of the truth if it's going to be truth. So so pretty powerful stuff, right? It's pretty powerful stuff. So as far as this thing that came up here about Michal and how she was upset when, because her father was Saul, and Saul lost his position because he hadn't successfully completed his initiations after his anointing and in his leadership of always being completely surrendered to God, the way that David had proved himself to God, which is why he ultimately became king, right? And so, Saul's daughter Michal felt, I guess she was feeling salt in the wounds of like them having lost their position, lost their authority. And so she insulted him, right? She insulted him, and it ended up cursing herself. She ended up not being able to have kids. And so what's the saying? I think in a way it should be a little bit encouraging that as long as you continue in your truth and in love and in a spirit of love, that whatever people might say or think about you, because there's always going to be people that are going to be feeling salty and feeling upset that they are not quite in the place where you're at, and feeling like somehow they deserve it, or it's like something that should have been given to them, but they just haven't quite gotten it yet in terms of the fullness of their lessons. And so they attack, right? So they point the finger and they get mad. But it's on some level, they're really mad at themselves for listening to the voice of their ego instead of the voice of like the depth of their sacred heart, and not being where you are yet, and being salty about it, and then ending up cursing themselves. So in a way, it's good to just be aware of these things, that some of these opponents, are kind of like that. But you mean, who are you? Like, ultimately, if you're still like having to work through this chessboard, who are you? I don't even want to kind of answer that about what your place in that is, or whether or not you want to even place yourself on that chessboard. Because like I said, you kind of are and you kind of aren't, right? Because you're getting this new home, this Shambhalaka in heaven, in this higher place. And while you're moving through that rolling hills place where you're going to come across some challenges. So, it comes back to that concept that's always good, an adage to remind yourself of being in the world and not of it. It's always been true, but I think right now it's becoming more true than ever because of the blessings that you're receiving from the Lord. And it's more important than ever to kind of wake up every day and remind yourself of the truth in how you are operating with everything in your everyday life. So, and some people here have been like really pulled back for a while from the world. And so this is kind of as you kind of start to move forward here with these blessings, it's good to be reminded of the things so you're not kind of going back in fully without maintaining the fullness of where, the blessing of that connection to heaven of where you started the journey. So I hope that makes sense. There is going to be like a lot more words that will talk about things, around this. I've got like a lot of words that I want to share over the next few weeks. And as we move through some big shifts, and, anticipate that a lot of what I'm talking about is going to be playing itself out between now and October-ish, and I don't want to give exact dates, but at that point in time, there's going to be a bigger shifting into the land of, we'll just say, untouchable blessings, which is, and endless, maybe endless isn't the right word, but just like at that point, everything that's coming in is coming in from heaven and from God in a way that cannot be touched and is completely a part of your eternal legacy. And that's really beautiful. But there's things that need to be worked out between now and then. It's sort of like, as God is sort of like changing the locks, if you will. It's kind of the best way to put it, as he's changing the locks. And he is changing the locks. So praise God. Continue to praise God and get really deep into your prayers every single day for at least an hour. Everybody, you need to be praying for at least an hour every single day. And I'm going to be back soon with another video. I'm sending you lots of love. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe. Please give this video a like. And I will talk to you soon. Take care.